Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the north by the Serbiansky forest area, where we see here that the Ukrainian forces launched an attack towards the Russian positions and managed to cut the road between the north and the south in this direction. So we're seeing that the Russian forces are now being pressured here to the south of Kreminna, while they're trying to launch operations to the northwest of the city. So we're seeing that there is a Ukrainian attempt to divert the resources of the Russian forces from the north to prevent them from launching further offensive operations by launching their own offensive operations in the forest area, which is drawing up a lot of the supplies the Russian forces have in the area, as well as combat capability due to the heavy fighting taking place in the area. We then move on to the Bakhmut direction, where here the Russian forces managed to capture the farm area here to the northwest of Bakhmut. This is an area which has been under Russian control before during the Wagner fighting over Bakhmut in the spring. So now we're seeing that the Russian forces have returned to this position, and with the operations to the north of Avdiivka, it is further indication that the Russian forces are launching their operations in preparation for an assault on the village of Avdiivka here to the northern flank of Bakhmut. With the developments here, we also receive reports that this fighting taking place in the northern flank of Bakhmut is being done by VDV fighters as well as former Wagner soldiers. So they have returned to the flanks, and in remembrance of Prigozhin, we have to remember the times where he complained about the lack of defenses in the flanks. It is now being done. So in the memory of Prigozhin, your wish lives on, although you do not. We then move on to the direction of Avdiivka, where here in the direction of Stoltenberg, heavy fighting is taking place, of which we get this video here. Released by Deep State Map, we see that it was geolocated to the village of Stoltenberg here in the northern flank of Avdiivka. And in this video, we see a Ukrainian helicopter flying around, avoiding fire from Russian air defense systems, whether it be man-pads, man-portable air defense systems, or long-range systems, we do not know. But we see a lot of flares being dropped from the helicopter as it flies very low. We also see Ukrainian tanks and infantry fighting within the village, trying to push out the Russian forces storming the village itself. And we see that it is clear by this video that Russian forces have reached into the center of the village, after which they're being pushed out by the Ukrainian soldiers, infantry and tanks, launching attacks against them. You may wonder how come Ukrainian helicopters can reach all the way over to Stoltenberg, yet we see a lack of Russian ones. Well, reason number one is that any helicopter can reach the front line. As when they fly low, it is hard to detect them. They cannot be detected by radar. They have to be detected by eyesight. And therefore, we see that these helicopters pretty much every time are able to reach the front line. The question is whether or not they're able to withdraw out of it, retreat out of it. And this is where Ukrainians have the advantage, because they are on the defensive. So the Russian soldiers do not have a lot of air defense mechanisms right next to the front line, while the Ukrainians may have a lot more close by, as they are the ones being pushed back mainly. So with this, we see that the Russian forces unlikely are to have a lot of air defense systems reaching the front line, specifically at the very edge of the front, while the Ukrainian forces would most likely have a lot here in the direction of Avdiivka, as it is one that they are focusing on. We can also see that the fact that the Russian forces are fighting within a bulge here in the northern and southern parts, which means that they are operating in areas further away from Russian air defense, for example, being by Donetsk, then it is more likely that in the northern flank, it will be difficult for them to be shooting down Ukrainian aircraft and helicopters, while in the southern flank, they're having a much easier time. Therefore, the Ukrainian forces are definitely able to reach the front line. Sometimes they lose the helicopters, sometimes they don't, as most of what they're facing off against are man-pads rather than anything else. We then move on to the city of Peremoha, where the Russian forces managed to recapture some parts here in the eastern outskirts of it. So we see the fact that the Russian forces were pushed to the very edge of the city, and now they're trying to recapture some of the positions. We saw this advancement based on the fact that the Ukrainians launched some FPV drones here in this direction towards Russian positions here on the outskirts of the city, and therefore we see that they have managed to advance, and this is likely to secure the crossing here in the eastern parts, allowing them to hold their positions here in between Vodiane and Peremoha. We then move on to this video here, which shows a Ukrainian M777 howitzer shooting towards Russian positions, but the most important part is the fact that it is not dug in, it is instead stuck on the surface, and when it shoots, it's blown back due to the inertia. That is because wherever this is filmed, the ground has frozen. And if we take a look at the temperature in different parts of the front line, we can see starting out here by Zaporizhia that it is currently positive at day and negative at night. But again, this Saturday, it becomes negative day and night. However, moving on to other areas like Avdiivka, we can see it already tonight. It will become negatives all the way to next Monday, at least. As for other areas like Peremoha, we see that it is from Tuesday night. In the Kharkiv direction, it has already started, as well as in Kiev. We can also see that it is dry on most days. There's hardly any snow or rain in most of these areas. And as such, with very dry weather combined with negative degrees through the hours all throughout a whole week, it is likely that if this weather continues, that it will be prime weather for offensive operations for either side. And I really emphasize this a lot because it is very important to how the war will continue in the coming months. And we see this already with signs from Jens Stoltenberg, where he says NATO should be ready for bad news from Ukraine. Stoltenberg warns, "We have to support Ukraine in both good and bad times." Famous last words. The point being that the Ukrainians have just gone through a 6-month-long offensive. It has definitely given them a lot of experience, but it has also given them a lot of casualties. They have lost a lot of units and equipment during these 6 months. At the same time, we also see the fact that they must be worn down. They must be tired at this point. And they were likely expecting a winter like last year, where there was hardly any room to operate during the whole winter season due to constant wet weather as well as high degrees despite it being in the winter. However, this year is completely different. It's much colder, much quicker than it was last year, and it's much drier as well. And therefore, we'll likely see very soon that the ground freezes, and that will completely change the nature of the fighting that we're currently seeing. The reason why we're seeing the fighting as it is taking place since the start of the fall season was because it was very wet, there was a lot of rain, and the weather quickly became muddy, the ground became muddy, unsuitable for armored operations. Therefore, we've seen a limited use of that. We saw an initial push by the Russian forces in the northern and southern flanks of Avdiivka with armored units that took place at the start of the offensive, because although the ground was muddy, if it hasn't been traversed through before, it is still able to be used for a couple of times, like 1 or 2 assaults at most, and then there would be nothing really to be able to transport. There would be no suitable roads and so on. However, if the situation changes and the ground becomes frozen, then we'll see the Russian forces being able to launch armored assaults really anywhere throughout the front line. And therefore, we'll likely see that the Russian forces throughout the front line, wherever they have gathered a lot of units, example Avdiivka, Peremoha, in the direction of Torsk and so on, as well as in the Kupiansk direction, we'll likely see a lot of Russian operations in these directions. We may even see a Russian counterattack in the direction of Robotyne. And at the same time, similar to the video with the M777 not being dug in, it is very difficult for Ukrainian forces to build new fortifications when the ground is frozen. This complicates the Ukrainian process at building fortifications. So the Ukrainians will be very time pressed to build fortifications in the different aspects and areas of the front line that has moved a lot, like the Zaporizhia front, and therefore they'll be vulnerable in these directions. And at the same time, the Russians will be able to launch offensive operations. I talked with a Russian soldier that I know, and he's at a position where he knows a bit more about tactics and strategies being used by the Russian forces than the average soldier. I asked him about the importance of the weather and how this affects the front line, and whether or not the Russians, quote unquote, would be celebrating at the turn of events with the weather. And he said, if this weather continues, if it continues being dry and cold, the Russians will most definitely be happy about it, because it enables the perfect circumstances for offensive operations in the winter weather. Although it is still very difficult with the cold weather being very difficult on the soldiers, hard on the soldiers, and diseases being spread due to this cold weather. So it is difficult, and it's definitely always going to be difficult fighting in the winter compared to the summer. The weather is much worse, but the ground situation, the ground being frozen, is the most suitable for armored operations. So we might most likely see successful armored operations during this winter period, comparing it to last year and the very start of the Russian invasion, which was at the end of February and mud was essentially everywhere. And again, that is another example of how the initial push will always succeed even in muddy weather due to grass and so on being present, making it still suitable for armored vehicles to drive through. But the second and third waves will not be able to arrive. But in the conditions of cold weather and frozen ground, they will most definitely be able to, and therefore it is more suitable for armored operations. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching and have a great day.